Welcome to this week's Live with Littlewood. As some of the more observant amongst you might observe, I'm not in our Westminster studio. I'm in beautiful, sunny Sri Lanka, and that's a good enough excuse to make this week's edition a super duper global Asia Pacific edition of Live with Littlewood. I say Live with Littlewood, we're recording this as live. It will go out a few hours after we put it in the can, so it's as Live with Littlewood. Really, we're being as live as we can be, but we're across 4 different time zones, and that's making it tricky to record. But we're going to put the world to rights as we'll always do in just an hour or so with a stellar lineup of guests on this special Asia Pacific edition of Live with Littlewood. Kaboom, kapow, welcome. Thanks for joining me for this week's Live with Littlewood. If you're enjoying the show, please make sure that you hit the thumbs up, the like button. If you're not yet a subscriber to the IEA London YouTube channel, please hit subscribe and the notification bell. That way you'll get all of the information about our huge plethora of upcoming videos. Later in the show, I'm going to be joined by my friend Rainer Heufers, who's the Executive Director of the Centre for Indonesian Policy Studies, to discuss how the free market is going in his country, and by the Executive Director of the New Zealand Taxpayers Union, Jordan Williams. He'll be talking to me about the zero COVID strategy that appears to have been applied in his country and whether it's paying off. But first up, I'm delighted to be joined from the home team in London, but really an Aussie, by the IEA's very own Head of Public Policy, Matthew Lesh. Matthew, good to have you with us. How are you, sir?
I'm flourishing. How are you, Mark?
I'm very, very good. It's nice and warm and sunny here. It's a bit cold over in London still, is it?
I'm viciously envy. I'm going to be honest.
Okay. Well, I'm not envying you. And a warm welcome to Live with Littlewood to Dhananath Fernando, the Chief Operating Officer of the Advocata think tank here in Sri Lanka. Warm welcome to you, Dana.
Thanks, Mark. Pleasure to be on your show. Thank you.
Great to have you with us. Let's kick off with Sri Lanka then. We're going to put up on screen some of the basic facts about Sri Lanka. Population just north of 20 million. GDP per capita about $4,000. Inflation, the inflation rate January of this year, 14%. Might be a taste of things to come in the rest of the world. Number of registered deaths from COVID, just over 15,000. Border status open, obviously. I couldn't be here otherwise. So, Dana, could you help give our viewers and listeners an overview of how things are in Sri Lanka at the moment? I've got a theory that the official names of countries don't really describe the country. The United Kingdom isn't particularly united. The United States of America definitely isn't united. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea is not really about the people democratic or a republic. So what are we to make of the Democratic Socialist Republic of Sri Lanka?
I think we are quite a deviation from your observation, Mark. We pretty much stick to the socialistic side of things since independence, since 1948, once we got the independence from the British rule. Just to fast track to the current situation, we are in a bit of a tight situation in our economy, of course, because of wrong economic policies that we have been adhering for quite a long time, and the situation is the very reason is basically for not adhering for a market system. We only had a reform attempt in 1997, but that was also like a half-hearted attempt, and the labor market reforms were not done properly. So as a result, we are in a bit of a tight situation, as you may have seen on Financial Times. We are on headlines with, of course, for wrong reasons, with the risk of debt sustainability, and we have mounting debt repayments with reserves for about $3 billion US in hand, but having about 6 billion to be paid this year. So in terms of debt sustainability, we have issues. Of course, our markets are not functioning. I mean, the market system is not functioning well. So as a result, the resource allocation is not optimized, and we are in a bit of a difficult situation this year in particular. But it doesn't mean that we have been in good shape for the last quite a few decades, Mark.
Okay, I want to dig into that a little bit. Going to the kind of Bible of freedom, the Heritage Index of Economic Freedom, Sri Lanka comes 131st out of 184 countries, doing particularly badly in the areas of free trade, regulation, and fiscal health. The index says to achieve greater economic freedom, the government would need to implement deep, broad, and well-institutionalized reforms to raise very low scores for property rights, judicial effectiveness, and government integrity. Debt reduction, which you've just touched on, Dana, would also be required. Now, you've written previously, Dana, that you think that Sri Lanka can learn some lessons from Singapore to try and supercharge your economy. What's your think tank agitating for? What are the key reforms that you would hope that the Sri Lankan government brings in? And even if there's no prospect of that in the immediate weeks or months, you know, what reforms do you think Sri Lanka needs very specifically over the next 3 or 4 years, 10 years even?
Yes, so we would like to start with the reforms mainly on the property side, because 82% of the Sri Lankan land is owned by the government. So people really don't own the land. So I think that's one of the key reforms that the government can consider, or the policymakers can consider, and we have been an active advocate for the property rights reforms. And secondly, it's the state sector and the state-owned enterprises reforms. We have a massive state sector. About 1.5 million of employees are in the state sector out of 8 million workforce, which is quite a large number under any given country's demography. And also, most of our state-owned enterprises are loss-making. I think it's the same case for most of the other countries as well. Our main state, like 5 institutes out of 527 state-owned enterprises, makes about 300 million rupees losses per day. That's in dollar terms about divided by 200, so about 1.5 million dollars of losses every day, according to the statistics. So that's the second reform that we would like to push. And third, again, mainly on the kind of tax reforms in the sense we have been taxing all the wrong sectors, and it's very complicated. So think about like less taxes and limited size of the government to explore. So that's the third reform. But of course, given a demographic of a country like Sri Lanka with $400,000 income, of course, there's quite a large poor sector, poor people in the Sri Lankan economy. So we also suggest some of the reforms like a cash transfer system to take care of poor, given the dynamics. So those are the broader reforms that we push at the moment. But there are quite a lot to be done, and our institutions are not strong. The markets are not operating. So broadly, it's a market-based reform system that we propose, but highlighting on zooming into some of the key areas.
Okay, so are we going to see the Sri Lankan government default on its debt? And would that be a good thing or a bad thing?
In terms of our debt situation, the problem is we borrowed a lot of debt in short maturity and invested in wrong assets, I would say, like non-revenue generating assets. So that is the main problem. So I think our numbers are quite awkward. Above 70% of government revenue is going as interest payment.
70%?
70% of the revenue is going only as interest payment. It is not only debt servicing, only as interest payment every year. So which
Geez, I thought the UK debt was bad. That's extraordinary. I mean, you're going to have to default, aren't you?
yes, so it is quite a weird number, and with debt servicing, it comes to about 142%, and I think we are quite closer to Lebanon, and so it's not sustainable at all. So, but our advice is think about reforms rather than thinking about like debt restructuring that may eventually come, or like people are considering about going to IMF. Of course, those all could be milestones in the journey, but we got into here because of the wrong economic policy and because of lack of reforms. So our advice have always been think of the reforms.
Okay, Donna. Well, there's one I want to touch on. Try and explain this to our viewers. One of your government's worst efforts, I'm told, to improve your balance of payment situation and to reduce international debt was what sounds to me like a completely harebrained scheme to save foreign currency by banning chemical fertilizers and forcing the country to become the first all-organic farming nation. A third of Sri Lankan agricultural land was left dormant last year. Food inflation hit over 20% last month. The government, I'm told, has promised about $200 million in compensation to farmers and another $140 million or so for subsidies in 2022. This seems like a ridiculous scheme. Is it now unraveling and being reversed?
The fertilizer policy hasn't been implemented. First of all, the policy has a big misperception that the government believed that the entire country could go for organic fertilizer in full swing overnight. So it was completely a disastrous decision in my view. At the same time, we also had a forex crisis, so we really didn't have money also to import fertilizer. So both situation came together, and as a result, of course, the food inflation, as you mentioned, hit record high, and there have been, and we are finding it, we are managing in a very sharp, in a very tight rope, I would say, on also importing some of the food items because our yield and the harvest is declining. Of course, that policy contributed to an extent for the current crisis we are in. But having said that, I must also say our agriculture is also not very productive because of the disastrous land policy, because 82% is owned by the land, is owned by the government. So the technology, the productivity wasn't coming into the agricultural fields because of that disastrous policy. And our agriculture sector is one of the unproductive sectors in Sri Lanka because 25% of our labor force is in agriculture, but they only contribute 8% to our GDP. So having fertilizer a few years ago, but without fertilizer, I can even predict the numbers. It will be going to be really a disaster. But the problem is we really didn't have forex as well to import the necessary food items. That's quite tricky, and that's where we are in. And the fertilizer decision, of course, fueled up the current crisis. Additionally to COVID, additionally to the other forex problem, and additionally to the stagnation of reform program. So that's how I see the situation, Mark.
Okay. Well, we were asking around a few days ago whether there was anybody at the Institute of Economic Affairs who knew about this Sri Lankan policy. And then it was pointed out to me that Matt had tweeted about it. And Matt, if you've tweeted about it, I know you're going to be a leading world expert in it, right? I mean, you're a leading world expert in most areas of policy. Explain to British viewers what's gone on here, Matt, what's happened with the policy, and is it as crazy as Dana and I have just implied?
Look, I think it's almost certainly as crazy, if not crazier. I mean, conceptually, particularly for a relatively poorer country, to be giving up on modern agricultural techniques seems totally insane. And it had the predicted effects. I mean, there's obviously a lot of other economic issues going on in Sri Lanka at the same time, but it did seem to have a direct correlation with reducing agricultural productivity. That's what pesticides allow you to do. Pesticides have an important role. I think it's also, though, an important lesson for the world. Is we hear a lot about organic farming and the evils of modern agriculture and how terrible it is. In many ways, modern agriculture is an absolute miracle. We look at Sri Lanka, a country that's not particularly efficient in agriculture, with something like, we said, about 25% of the population in the agriculture sector. In the UK, it's about 1%, and we produce far more food. And we also, over time, are producing more food using less fertilizer, using less water, using less land. It's all about improving efficiencies. And what really, I suppose, strikes me about the Sri Lankan situation, not that I'm an expert whatsoever, is just comparing it to China's development path, another supposedly communist country. Their first process when they were doing the kind of market reforms in the 80s was the very quietly allowing farmers to keep their surplus produce, creating kind of a secondary market, and then eventually privatizing a lot of the agricultural sector, which increased efficiency. And obviously before that, China had huge issues with starvation and famine and millions and millions of people dying as a result of socialistic policies that are very top down. So in terms of a development path, it seems private ownership is key. And then it seems obviously moving from an agricultural sector to an industrializing. What I'm interested about Sri Lanka is there has been about 4 times increase in per capita GDP over the last 20 years. I'm interested to find out from our guests, what do you think kind of led to some of that growth in recent history? Obviously, it's not been ideal, and Sri Lanka's GDP is relatively low, but it's much higher than Pakistan or Nepal. Is there something Sri Lanka's done well?
Matt, that's a really interesting question. Let me put that to Dana and just say that stat again. GDP's gone up by a factor of what?
I think about 4 times over the last 20 years, maybe a little bit, maybe 3 or 4 times since 2000. And compared to Pakistan or Nepal, a lot of other nearby countries, Sri Lanka's a lot more successful economy.
Matt, thanks for that stat. I'm glad we're moving on to more optimistic territory. Dana, explain that to us. That sounds like pretty good economic growth. I mean, obviously, everywhere in the world, all of us sort of free market liberals want to go further and faster and better. But wow, I mean, that's not bad GDP growth compared to your immediate neighbors or similar countries, right?
Yes, Mark. So you need to understand a little bit about the history of Sri Lanka. We had a war for 30 years since 1970s, and it ended in 2008. So what happened was we got the access for capital markets in 2007. Because till then we were a poor, low-income country, so we had a lot of concessional loans from all multilateral agencies and to an extent with bilateral creditors. So we got the access of the commercial markets in 2007, and most of these bond payments, which was taken at 6%, 7% interest rates, came to on the repayment terms in 2000 after 2012, 13. So as you can see, after that, during that period, most of these borrowed money invested in projects, as I mentioned, which is non-revenue generating. So as a result, because of the government spending, our GDP grew at about 8% at one point, but it was not in the tradable sector because it was in the because of the government spending. But now, of course, after spending so heavily on short maturity at 6% borrowing, and now we have to pay, and now our credit rating is at CC. Literally, we really don't have access for the financial markets, and we have to pay what we have borrowed in the past decade. So now our growth was kind of like negative. Of course, COVID had an impact. But even our growth numbers was negative in the very first quarter of the COVID year. So that shows that the money was not very well spent, and we lost the access for the capital markets very recently. So that was the reasoning for the high numbers. But of course that increment was good. But the problem was that that growth came with wrong reasoning. It was not on the tradable sector. The reforms were not done. So at this point, the Sri Lankans have to suffer for the same reasons they enjoyed some time ago, and they really didn't see that crisis is coming, and it was brewing every day. And now the situation is quite I would say difficult.
Okay, well, listen, there's 2 big issues which are really global issues that every corner of the world is dealing with. One is, how have we dealt with the COVID-19 pandemic? And I'm going to ask some questions about that. And the other is, what do we make of China, and what should a sensible strategy towards China be? And to help us navigate that, Dana and Matt, I'll come back to you on those issues as well. Delighted to welcome to the show Rainer Heufers, Executive Director at the Centre for Indonesian Policy Studies. Rainer, lovely to have you with us. Thanks so much for joining us, my friend. Good to see you.
Thanks for having me.
I'm going to come on to Indonesia and its challenges and opportunities in a minute, but I wonder if you can help me a bit on how do you think that we should be approaching China? I reckon maybe 5, 10, 15 years ago, the broad view of those of a liberal perspective was engage, trade, work with the Chinese, and China would continue to liberalize across the board, not just economically, but in terms of civil liberties as well. I think it would be fair to say in the United Kingdom, that initial theory is coming under some considerable scrutiny, and people are actually starting to wonder whether China is more of a threat than an opportunity. How do you see it from an Indonesian perspective? China obviously looms large right across the globe, but particularly in this part of it. What's your take on China, Rainer? Should we be optimistic, pessimistic? What should the strategy be? There you go. Easy first question.
Very easy. Let me solve both problems in the next 2 minutes. So thanks, Mark. The thing is, I am actually by training, I am a sinologist. I'm a China watcher since 1983. That reveals age a little bit. So I've always been the optimist, but now I'm very, very concerned about what's happening under this current president in China. What we see is basically going down to a totalitarian country, basically. And you need to take that into consideration when you deal with this leadership. And I'm very concerned that we must differentiate between leadership and country, because that is something so important, because there is a nationalist trend also in China. So we must talk about the Communist Party leadership versus the rest of the country. That is, I find it very important in our rhetoric. Coming from Indonesia, this is a region that is located strategically between the Chinese hemisphere and, if you want, the Western hemisphere. Important trade routes, Sri Lanka, obviously Indonesia as well. So this is an area, especially Southeast Asia, that is located between, and therefore always wanted to stay as neutral as possible, especially Indonesia. Thailand went down the American path, so to speak. Cambodia very much with the Chinese, but Indonesia always wanted to stay out. Bandung Conference, you may remember, non-alignment movement, etc. It was all, let's not engage. Now, the Chinese are expanding economically. That's their right, and that's what they should be doing in a way. That's a good thing, giving us cheaper products and also some new technology coming from them now. What we see in this region here is that the US and also the European engagement is not strong enough. It's sometimes characterized as fly in, fly out diplomacy. Southeast Asia smiles. There is a foreign minister coming. Obviously, they want something. Something brewed up in Beijing or somewhere else. Somebody's going to fly in and talk to us how we need to close ranks. But when it's not happening, nobody's here. And this I can also say from when I'm engaging with leaders in or parties or political factors in Europe, how disinterested they are in the region, basically. And never mind, there is an Indo-Pacific strategy now, European Union, America as well. But I think it has to really be taken seriously. And that's, I believe, where I need to put the focus.
Really interesting. So you actually think that some of this is that the West needs to show more ambition and outreach to places like Sri Lanka, Indonesia, and Asia in general. We're ignoring you and just being a bit too introspective, you'd say, Rainer, yeah?
That's right, or focusing on other issues. Obviously, there are important issues, right? I mean, you don't want to talk to anybody in politics at the moment in Europe. It would be about the Ukraine, which is absolutely necessary and important topic to discuss. But there are other regions, there are other issues in the world, and Southeast Asia plays an important role here. So yeah, sure. Absolutely.
Dana, on the Chinese question, your thoughts as well. A big story going back a few years, I think it was 2017, 2018, the Chinese government effectively forced Sri Lanka to give up a port to cover debts owed to the Chinese export banks. The Chinese government lent Sri Lanka a bit over $300 million US. to fund the project. Sri Lanka had to use a preferred Chinese company to build it. The debt expanded and expanded and expanded. You've been talking about that more generally in terms of Sri Lankan finances. When the government couldn't pay the interest on it, the Chinese government insisted that a Chinese company take on majority shareholding and gained access to 15,000 acres of land surrounding the port. What's the Sri Lankan view of how we should approach relations with China, Dana?
Yes, Mark. So China and there's a big geopolitical battle also, which is known in this region. So for Sri Lanka, for a country like Sri Lanka, India is like the big brother. Our culture and most of our history has been influenced also by India. At the same time, now China is coming with their Belt and Road Initiative, and we have quite close bilateral trade and negotiations with China. So I think how people perceive is China and anyway, Sri Lankans generally have a very negative perception towards working with other countries. They are not very open-minded. They always see some conspiracy, some Westerners. China is trying to overtake, India is trying to intervene and all that. Maybe because our history is we have been invaded by British, by Portuguese, by Dutch, and we have quite a bit of history. And of course, we had quite recent also bad experiences, like a 30-year-long war thereafter, even post-independence, and there was the Easter Sunday attack. Likewise, our history, the memory has not been very positive with working with different parties. So that is a challenge in the first place. But at the same time, when it comes to the debt or like the bilateral investments with other countries, basically we had a very good relationship with Japan. And even in terms of our bilateral debts, it's about 10%, which is like the main creditor for Sri Lanka, and which came like for a very low interest and for a longer maturity period, like 20 years, 30 years. And of course, this is also coming when I think some of the countries trying to impose trade restrictions on Japan. It was the Sri Lankan then president who requested the global stage that let's not do that. Let's embrace Japan and let's work with everybody. And I think they still consider that as a favor that Sri Lanka really took on stage on behalf of Japan. Okay. When it comes to China, our bilateral debt is somewhat equal to Japan, but it's slightly lower than Japan. But about 8% of that debt is coming from the China Exim Bank, which is at very high interest rates. So the example that you took on the Hambantota port, likewise, most of this debt has been taken on commercial interest rates and invested, as I mentioned, on non-revenue generating assets or like projects. So that's where the concern came for a lot of Sri Lankans, whether we are really whether we invested on the right projects. Okay. So I think that's the concern for in the political circles on civil society activists, whether are we investing it in right assets, or whether do we get like some sort of an influence to invest it in wrong assets and like to make it like a debt trap sort of a thing. So that's where the concern came in. But my view is, given the size of our economy and given the dynamics, we have to interact with all countries, and like definitely India and Japan and US, mainly, but India and Japan have a bigger impact. But now they are also like a movement called Quad, where India, Japan, US, and Australia in one side, and China is on the other side. So for us, like a small country, as you mentioned in the Heritage Foundation Economic Freedom Index, as well as the Fraser Institute Economic Freedom of the World Index, we are performing very poorly on global trade. I mean, on Fraser Institute Index, we are at 149 out of 165 countries on freedom for trade. So for us, we have to trade with each other, and China is one of our main importers. For us to be competitive in the exports, we have to work with China. But I go with Reina, we have to be very careful when we say China, the people of China versus the leaders. We have to make that we have to make that demarcation or distinguishment between those two. But for us, we have to interact with everyone, is my view.
Okay, Matt, I want to come to you very quickly on this. Can you, Matt, talk to us about where you are on a hawkish or dovish approach to China, and whether, actually the more dovish and engagement approach might not have yielded the results that some optimists wanted? And also, can you take on Rainer's challenge, this sort of fly in, fly out diplomacy? I thought the whole point of Brexit was we were going to be a kind of global Britain that would extend our horizons, reaching out to the world, places like Sri Lanka and Indonesia. Sounds from our friends that we're not doing a particularly good job of that just now.
No, I mean, I don't think that there's ever doing enough of a successful diplomatic approach. I mean, I think that the China question, though, just to answer that first, is quite fascinating. Australia's relationship with China has very much transfigurated in recent years. There was a lot of optimism through the 2000s that effectively Australia didn't have to choose between its traditional security defense partnership with the US and then kind of building economic relations with China. Since particularly around 2006, security laws, in the policy set, there was a lot of concern about Xi and a more aggressive China. And then particularly since COVID, that's very much blown up when Australia questioned where COVID had come from and called for an independent investigation before any other country. And you can really see in the attitudes of the public Australia when it comes to China have changed. So the Lowy Institute, foreign policy think tank, do regular surveys of Australian attitudes. And in 2018, they found 82% of people believed that China was more of an economic partner than a security threat, versus just 12 people who thought China was a security threat. In the latest poll last year, 63% of Australians thought China was a security threat. So now the general consensus in Australia is that China is a serious security threat and more or less of an economic partner. Mm-hmm. That said, though, of course, Australia still trades a lot with China. And even with all the restrictions put up, Australia, I think, has had a record year of trade with China, particularly with iron ore. So there is kind of still a strong economic relationship. It's a very tense political relationship, and there's been a lot of demands from China against Australia about a bunch of different issues. I think there's probably a want to calm things down a bit. But at the same time, you've got AUKUS, Australia signing up with the UK and the US, and you've got a lot of efforts like the Quad in order to counter China. So I think that's very much Australia's foreign policy path at the moment.
Donna, we're going to say goodbye to you shortly. I just want in a couple of sentences, no more than that, because time is ticking. Are you out of the COVID pandemic crisis yet? Are you out the other side in Sri Lanka? I must admit, I was actually hugely impressed about how quickly I got through Colombo Airport. I thought I was going to be stuck there for hours. I mean, there was endless bureaucracy. I had forms coming out of my ears that I had to fill in and QR codes, but I got through the airport pretty quickly. Is Sri Lanka out of the other side of this crisis at last? Just in a sentence or two, Dana.
We have done really well on COVID front because our vaccination rates were very high. Of course, we have a public healthcare system, which with our vaccination rates are high, and also in tourism, because since we have a forex crisis, tourism is one of our main forex earners. So we had to release that regulatory barrier. So even if you have, like, I think a PCR test of 72 hours prior, you can just easily get the immigration cleared and into the country. So in that front, actually, we have done quite well, but our death numbers are comparatively low. But we have about, like, compared to our 20 million population, about 13,000 to 15,000 deaths. But I think we have done quite well in terms of the COVID front, as I see, Mark.
Okay. Donna, it's been great to have you on the show. I'm glad to be doing my tiny little bit as a tourist in your beautiful country to try and improve GDP growth and your trade deficit. It's lovely to be here. Beautiful country. Donna, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you.
Pleasure to have you, and good luck in all your endeavours. Rainer, let me come back to you. I want to talk a bit about Indonesia. We'll put up for our viewers a slide on the screen. I think most will know, largest island nation in the world, largest Muslim country in the world. Population 270 million. I don't know where that puts it on the chart. About the 6th largest country in the world, something like that. You'll be able to correct me. GDP per capita, $5,000. Inflation, only 2% at the moment. About 150,000 deaths, a bit shy of that from COVID on the last numbers I looked at, Rainer. Tell us the story of Indonesia, because I think for some, this could be the next super duper kind of Asian power, right? And as you say, we might be fly in, fly out diplomacy, but we should be taking rather more notice of Indonesia, no?
I couldn't agree more. Thanks for saying that. It's the fourth largest country in the world by population, right after the United States. And the dimensions east-west also equal roughly San Francisco to New York. So it's a huge country. Yeah, it doesn't get the attention it deserves, but that's partly also the fault of the country, because they should get out more on the international stage and represent itself. It is actually a success story. I mean, you heard from Dana about the great things that happened in Sri Lanka in terms of GDP growth. Indonesia is also a success story. You know, Asian tigers, Indonesia was always aspiring to be among those. It has become an upper middle income country right before COVID hit. Then it took a dip, but generally speaking, you know, that was a remarkable success. And look at poor people. For me, it's always about free markets must work for the poor. So poverty headcount, that means a lot to me, has come down from 20% in 2000 to 10% now. So halved, when the population grew by 70 million people at the same time. So that means millions and millions of people are now able to earn a living. So all of this is basically good story here. But there are problems. I guess we're coming to those.
Ignoring the last couple of years, which obviously been pretty grim across the world because of COVID, right? Now, what's GDP growth been in Indonesia then? Over, I mean, Asian tiger levels, 5%, 6%, 7%, something like that.
Not quite that, but yeah, absolutely. Around 5%. The target was always to get to 7%, but 5% was roughly what was achieved. And again, that's not bad when you look at so many other economies over the years.
Okay, so what reforms are needed? I'm delighted we're moving to a more kind of upbeat and optimistic part of the show now, right? Because Dana gave us a pretty grim picture of some of the problems. But your institute, Centre for Indonesian Policy Studies, and we'll have a link to you guys in the show notes below. You won the coveted Templeton Freedom Award in 2020 for your work on the removal of trade barriers in Indonesia's food sector. Tell us about that, and tell us about the reforms that you at CIPS are pushing for and advocating. And are you pushing water uphill, or are you finding you're pushing water downhill? How's it feeling?
Okay, absolutely. Well, yeah, that was an amazing moment for us to win that award. That was really also a game changer for us. The thing is that, you know, we want to promote open markets. And as I said earlier, it has to work for the poor. I mean, if it only works for an urban elite, that doesn't do the trick, especially not in a rural country that still has rather low incomes. So we need to pick a topic that actually resonates with people. And the topic that we identified is food prices, and agriculture. Because this is such an important topic in the country. Dana was just now speaking about fertilizer issues, stuff like that. So we started with basically comparing prices. The amount of money you pay for apples in this country is far higher than in any European supermarket. That can't be right. The amount of money you pay for rice, soy, or all the staple foods and everything is far above world market prices. It's twice as high, 3 times as high. It's a huge country, as I said earlier, so it's very inward looking. You know, ask an American in the central part of the States what the prices are in comparison to Europe, they would never know. Same in Indonesia. It's such a huge country, they wouldn't know what's happening in other countries. So we keep telling them, you're paying more than Singapore. Singapore is far richer in absolute terms. You're paying more than in Singapore. That can't be right. And Singapore is importing everything. So we are suggesting imports can help. That was initial stage, and that's where we recommended reforms, reducing all the bureaucratic requirements, recommendations letters from the Ministry of Agriculture, licenses from the Ministry of Trade, all done case by case and not in an automated licensing system. So you can imagine that opens all gates for fraud, corruption, etc. So we addressed this, and we managed to actually persuade the government to actually review some of these regulations. We calculated altogether that if they would fully liberalize the food trade, Indonesian poor only could save $6 billion a year.
Wow.
And you can imagine what that would do to their lives. Due to the reforms that we believe we have helped to trigger, at least it went down by 2 billion, not only for the poor, but for the general, the population in general. So it had an impact, and that's why we were able to win that award.
And was the underlying problem tariff barriers or non-tariff barriers, a mixture of the two? I mean, it's that Indonesia has not been sufficiently open to global trade is the problem, but was that this licensing system or huge taxes, tariffs on imports, or a bit of both?
You start with a cultural story, really. After 400 years of colonial rule, the country really wanted to be independent, also in all its supplies, food supplies in particular, right? The founding president, right at the beginning, 1945, said, we shall not be dependent on other countries' food. Understandable, coming from foreign oppression and for such a long time, but of course, economically not rational, not sound. So this attitude we're still dealing with. So people say naturally we should only eat Indonesian food. And we're saying this doesn't make sense. And it's not the case. Just look at it, where the food is coming from. It's not the case. So it's a cultural, it's a historic thing that we are facing. But then in technical terms, you're right. It's a mix. It's mostly non-tariff measures because we all agree nowadays on reduced tariffs and so on, all of that. The non-tariff ones are the nasty ones that are very hard to actually grasp, and some of them are necessary when it comes to sanitary controls, etc., and others are not. Pre-shipment inspections and other things could be much more effective and less costly. So that's what where we're putting the focus. We're trying to calculate and show to the government, if you only reduce this, we were already able to bring down the food prices in this country. Regulations like which ports are allowed to actually have imports coming from other countries. You know, this doesn't make sense. I mean, and that you end up, of course, with the central ports. But what about those ports and regions of Indonesia that are far away and have no access to global trade because of it? And they pay the highest food prices. So these are the things we are addressing.
Before we move on to Australasia, Rona, how has Indonesia dealt with the COVID pandemic? What sort of restrictions or lockdowns have been imposed? Do you think the government over there has taken a balanced approach, or too restrictive, or too slow? Tell us the picture of dealing with the COVID problem. And again, the question I asked to Dana, are you through the worst of it now? You know, is the end in sight, or is the end even here? You know, is it over? Is it now an historical episode, or is it an ongoing crisis?
No, actually, we're bracing at the moment. Everybody is extremely nervous at the moment. Case numbers are doubling. The issue is, of course, are case numbers still the relevant measure? This is also being discussed here. Should it be hospitalization rates, etc.? But as a matter of fact, we're now at about 30, 40,000 cases a day. And I think it'll go up to a few 100,000 cases a day, just because Omicron has not fully hit the country. And everybody is bracing for the impact. So no, we're not done with that. That's unfortunately still coming our way. But all in all, I don't think the country had a bad way to respond. I mean, there were lots of issues with getting the vaccines in the country. Everything could have been done in a better way. But generally speaking, India set a very bad example right at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. You might remember the images that we saw on TV about India when they tried to a hard lockdown on people who live of their daily income. They sell a little bit, and with that money, they immediately buy the food. How are they supposed to be locked at home? You know, it won't work. And Indonesia has a similar situation. So the government saw this and knew we can't go that way. So it never happened. Of course, there were all these restrictions in place that actually had a heavy toll on the country. We had seen millions falling again under the poverty line in 2020, but we saw a certain recovery already in 2021. So all in all, I must say, I felt at least it was a measured approach that was undertaken. Civil liberties were not cut, except that, of course, you weren't able to enjoy all the facilities that you usually would be able to enjoy. And we have another factor in Indonesia, and that was we had this horrible Asian financial crisis 20 years ago, a few more than 20 years, 1998.
Yeah.
And at that time, Indonesia, it was so badly hit with 90% debt over GDP and these kind of things. And Indonesia has, from then on, really done its homework. It brought down debt over GDP to about 10, 15%.
Wow, we need that magic recipe. We could do with that in the United Kingdom.
We had excellent finance ministers, I must really say, that were really careful. The fiscal deficit was always about 1.5 to 2.5%. Ever since the crisis back then. So all of this was under control. Now, being a German by nationality, I appreciate that you save in time so that when the crisis hit, you actually have money. And Indonesia, in a way, has done that. So with this kind of debt over GDP and fiscal deficit, when it got worse, now we were at, it really jumped to 6.5 fiscal deficit. But that's only in 1 year, and the government is determined to bring it back below 3% in 2 years or so. And we are in the debt over GDP, we're still only at about 40%. So this is still much more for a developing country than for a European nation, for example, but still, I mean, we're talking about reasonable ratios.
Well, I want us to improve our fly-in, fly-out diplomacy because it looks like we've got quite a lot to learn from Indonesia on fiscal prudence, Rainer, really, in the UK and the Western world. Rainer, it's been great to have you with us. Thanks for all the great work you do in Indonesia. I hope to have you back on the program soon. And thanks for that, giving us something to be a bit optimistic about, I think. And we just need to raise our sights a little in the Western world and I think engage rather better. But it's been great having you on the show, Rainer. See you again soon in person, I hope. All the best.
Thank you.
So
bye-bye.
We're going to move on now to New Zealand and Australasia. This is going to be the tricky part of the show because I've got Matt and Ozzy on, and I'm delighted to be joined by the Executive Director of the New Zealand Taxpayers Union, Jordan Williams. But having a Kiwi and an Aussie on for the last 20 minutes, I mean, this could get pretty messy, right? But let's have a look at some of the New Zealand statistics. I mean, probably a country known rather better to us in the UK than Sri Lanka and Indonesia, especially for those of you who are fans of Lord of the Rings or the sport of rugby, or egg chasing, as I call it. I'm a fan of the other code of football. Population 5 million, GDP 243 billion, GDP per capita about $47,000. Inflation, well, similar problems in New Zealand to those that we're facing in the United Kingdom, touching 6%. COVID death toll very small, but border status closed. Jordan, great to have you on the show. Thanks for joining us, my friend. Great to have you with us. Give us your take. How are things in Kiwi land just at the moment? And when might any of us be able to visit you in the future? This year, next year, sometime next decade?
Well, I think it will be this year, Mark. And can I just say, it's great to see you. It is events like this that remind me how tough it's been to be stuck in paradise at the bottom of the world. I actually know Rainer pretty well. He was the facilitator of it was called the Think Tank MBA I did in the US a number of years ago. And I am really looking forward to catching up with you, Mark, and your team when Jacinda Ardern finally lets us out. So let me just take a step back on the COVID question. New Zealand was pretty unique because we've got an enormous moat around us. Our closest country, Australia, it's still 2.5, 3 hour flight away. And really what all this government was good at was locking us down, drawing up the drawbridge. We had a very tough lockdown, probably one of the toughest, if not the toughest in the world, certainly the toughest in any Western democracy. And I think probably only possible because New Zealand, we're not probably that's changing now, but not very polarized, and New Zealanders certainly came together. We did an elimination strategy, but then it became clear that either New Zealand was the smartest country in the world or the dumbest, but we're probably not going to know for a very long time as to which one it is. Now, of course, the Delta and then Omicron comes along, and it's just impossible to, keep the genie out of the bottle. And the real challenge that the government has now is you've got a population that the average Kiwi is worried about this COVID thing. We had our record number of cases a few days ago, and it was only about 250. And that was the scariest day New Zealand's had. But because we just haven't had it in New Zealand, it's now the threat of the unknown. And the problem that the government has is they actually want to open up for the rest of the world, but it's proving politically very difficult to do because they've been scaring the populace for coming up 2 years.
Let me put you the hypothesis, Jordan, that you're the dumbest country in the world, if I may. I was just looking at those stats again. COVID death toll in New Zealand is 53. I mean, terrible for those 53 people. But I mean, maybe these restrictions have kept, the illness and mortality rates down. But I mean, this is
more people drown in our rivers or at beaches than 53.
Yeah. So why not ban people going into water then? If you're, if you're worried, it just, my impression, this seems like a monumental overreaction. Now, I get the island thing. I get that it's kind of easier to stop people moving in and out than it is on, say, mainland Europe, for sake of argument. So the possibility of those like complete lockdown restrictions. But why is it that you Kiwis, who I thought were made of sterner stuff, aren't up in arms about this? This seems to me to be an absolutely incredible restriction on your civil liberties and your economic freedom. I don't know how badly this has hit the New Zealand economy for a problem that is not on the sort of scale that most of the rest of the world has experienced.
I'm going to play a little bit devil's advocate here, because I'm not a fan of our particular strategy. But that said, remember, right at the beginning, we didn't know how scary this thing was. And it was probably rational, and Australia did the same thing, to bring the drawbridge up. We successfully eliminated it and had, up until the second half of last year, when Delta came along, almost no restrictions. I mean, you've got to wear the masks on public transport, but except for those first months we had, or 2 months where we had the very harsh lockdown, we lived in relative freedom. And compared to, we didn't have waves or anything like that. We just lived without COVID normal lives and looked in bewilderment at what was going on in the rest of the world. That said, the government sort of got ready, as every Western government did right at the beginning, to this economic Armageddon, and put the New Zealand economy on absolute sugar money. We were only number 2 behind the US in terms of the economic stimulus, the government as a proportion of the economy. But of course, we didn't have the wholesale shutdowns over the extended periods of time that a lot of the rest of the world had. What that has meant is that we have enormous inflation. Just out in December, a 5.9% annualized inflation, which, New Zealand led the world with single policy targeting of inflation from the Reserve Bank. And yet now, unfortunately, the bad old days of inflation, the impacts that has on inequality are back. And just in terms of growth of government, since Jacinda Ardern was elected in 2017, the government is now 41% larger. Now, that is an enormous hangover to have. And what organisations such as mine here at the Taxpayers Union is that hangover, because if only that expansion of government was good quality spending, but as I'm sure you'll appreciate, Mark, governments aren't very good at that when they're literally printing.
Yeah, the empirical record isn't great. Can you give me any examples of good government spending? I mean, usually it's pretty inefficient and unproductive, usually, compared to the private sector. That's interesting. I want to come back to the wider economic non-COVID issues in a minute. But Matt, let me come to you. Look, I mean, I'm disappointed with both you and Jordan, to be honest. You guys down in Australasia, New Zealand, you're supposed to be, I guess in Australia, I've still got memories of Crocodile Dundee, stuff like this should just be a mere flesh wound. Who's been the dumbest country in the world for you, Matt? And Australia's been, pretty strict as well. I know you yourself have been caught up in lockdowns in your native country. What's your take of it there? I gather at last Australia's going to open the borders in a couple of weeks' time, but wow, what restrictions you've had.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm going to be a little bit of a patriot here for a moment and say a few things in defense of Australia, which I know is not the particularly popular view on the free market side overseas. But Australia has, in a similar way, although slightly less successfully than New Zealand, managed to keep deaths from COVID relatively low by global standards. And it used its natural advantages. It made some good strategic choices. Australia, you might not remember, but in February 2020, at the start of February 2020, banned anyone who'd been in China in the last 2 weeks. We were told by the World Health Organization at the time, because Trump did it, that was racist policy. It was actually a good policy. Australia then also introduced border quarantine measures, and much actually probably to the surprise of Australian policymakers, managed to effectively suppress the virus. And eliminate it temporarily. And that meant for most Australians over the last 2 years, for most of the time, they've lived in relative freedom and prosperity without lockdowns, without many COVID deaths. Now, the failure here, though, was a failure to procure and vaccinate fast enough, although that issue is now being resolved. And then the secondary failure, I think this is where the point we're getting to now, is a failure to move on. And New Zealand's got this much worse because New Zealand hasn't had a major wave of COVID. Australia, over the last month or so, has had actually quite significant COVID numbers. At one point, some of the highest COVID rates per capita in the world, over 100,000 cases per day in Australia. But because Australia was already vaccinated by that point, it's led to relatively few deaths. Australia's reopening, the borders are reopening. The one exception is Western Australia, which is the kind of effectively Jacinda Ardern equivalent of Australia under Mark McGowan, a Labor Premier. So overall, the struggle is not necessarily the initial strategy was a failure, although some lockdowns were too harsh and mean and unnecessary. Overall, I think it's proven quite a success. The point about Australian psychology is quite interesting. And is Australia this, freedom-loving, rejecting authority land? I mean, I think it's a common myth that Australia was founded by convicts. It's actually founded by convict masters, that the people who were responsible for managing the convicts.
Everyone likes to massage their history.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's an interesting fact that the most Australians that don't really descend from convicts, the early history was a mixture of European immigration. And there's always been a bit of a dependence on the state and not much of like a philosophical, maybe from the free market side of things occasionally, but not much of a philosophical objection to the existence of the state. So Australians say they hate the state and talk against it quite a lot, but are also willing to accept its dictates quite willingly. And I think that's come out during COVID. If they think it's in the interest, it's all very utilitarian here. If they think it's kind of justifiable, Australia has compulsory helmet laws, for example. Now, I don't think you can justify that on a harmless principle basis, because the only person I'm harming by not wearing a helmet is myself. But yet that seems to be kind of collectivist policy. And there's a bunch of policies like that in Australia that are quite nanny status and interventionist. So unfortunately, it's not quite the land of the free that we might hope for.
Jordan, let me come back to you. I haven't looked up New Zealand or Australia in these international indexes of freedom, but basically, you guys tend to perform pretty well. You tend to be in the top half a dozen or so. You were mentioning sort of things now drifting in the wrong direction, highest inflation rate in 30 years, problems that seem to echo in the UK as well on property prices. Median rent of property in New Zealand went up 25% between 2017 and 2021. That's quite a hike. And our average house prices have increased by 60% over that period. It seems, I mean, were you starting towards the top of the table, but are you worried you're now drifting in the wrong direction in terms of the overall economic picture? I think you also said under the Ardern government that we've seen government spending increase by 40%. I mean, that's colossal. I appreciate some of that might be COVID dependent, but all of this is a trajectory that we free market liberals should be pretty worried about, right?
I think it's the most worrying time for the freedom movement, certainly in my lifetime. It's actually interesting, you mentioned the housing prices going up by 60%, 58 I had, since this government was elected. And the irony is Jacinda Ardern was elected to fix the housing problem. It's a classic illustration of just across so many areas of public policy, this government is comms-led, but in terms of what they're delivering has just been a disaster for New Zealand's economic prosperity.
Jordan, can you talk to us about Kiwi Build? I'm fascinated by this.
It's just the government literally was elected on this promise that was going to build 100,000 homes, and in the space of 6 years, it's built about 1,200. It's just so like laughably bad. The gap between what is promised and what is delivered by this government. I mean, it's like carbon emissions was the other big thing. They come into government, they make this dramatic, out of nowhere, they ban oil and gas exploration, totally remove the confidence of the sector. And instead, our emissions from energy went up dramatically the last few years because we've got power stations, instead of running on gas, and now importing the worst coal in the world. Sorry, Indonesia, but that's where it comes from. And it's just classic, like, comms-led government. That's what Jacinda Ardern's very much sort of, it's all about image. It's not thoughtful public policy. Just going back to Matthew's comments, I thought that was the point about helmets is really interesting, because of course one of the things that, as clearly I work in the economics area as you guys do, but the freedom discussions around vaccination or quasi-compulsory vaccination by using things like we have vaccine passes here. I mean, we don't make you get a vaccine, but basically we stop you living your life. You're not allowed to go to, if you don't get one. And I think helmets actually is the parallel I've been looking for, because it's about, I know one of your former guests, I'm a huge fan of, Kate Andrews, wrote for The Spectator and said that, well, at what point do we have a public health system that serves us versus us having to support the public health system? So there's just across the freedom divide, and I know that reasonable minds can differ on the vaccine stuff, but in terms of freedom, we are going downhill. New Zealand has been, we are always top the charts in terms of perceptions of corruption. That one was out last week, and economic freedom, easiness or ease of doing business. Let me tell you, running a taxpayers union at the bottom of the world, those bloody charts that the likes of the IEA and Heritage make my job that much harder, because there is a real complacency in New Zealand at the moment about, that we're so good. And you look where New Zealand came from. We were the socialist republic through the 70s and early 80s, literally were hours from calling in the IMF. We were so stuffed. Went through what took a generation under Thatcher or Reagan and various both Labor and Liberal governments in Australia. We had that basically overnight in a Labor government that led the world on a lot of these reforms in terms of getting us back into the black, in terms of inflation targeting of our, and Reserve Bank, in terms of our Fiscal Responsibility Act, which led the world under former Minister of Finance Ruth Richardson, which I should plug, just joined our board. And yet, since the early 90s, the reform has stopped, and we have just drifted. The Jacinda Ardern government, because of the popularity over COVID, for the first time under our electoral system, which we've had since 1996, has got a full majority. We've got no upper house, no House of Lords or Senate equivalent. And the mask is off. For the first time in my lifetime, we are going backwards really fast. I wasn't joking when I said earlier, across every area of public policy, this government is not wasting the opportunity. And they learnt the lesson from those reforms in the 1980s that you swamp the opposition. And our job, and groups like the Taxpayers Union or your sort of equivalents around Tufton Street, Mark, is that we sort of have a bit of a saying that we got to pick fights in order to take public policy forward or to prevent reversal. Is we've got to pick fights. Right now, it's actually the opposite, that you're so swamped, you're having to pick them at the other meaning of what the heck is the most important, because we are spread so thin. So I don't mean to be pessimistic, but in terms of the prosperity of my children, I really fear that New Zealand is going to go back to where we were in the 60s and 70s and early 80s.
I've got an idea for you then. Maybe this would help concentrate minds. We need a new freedom index, which isn't about the spot price, but is about the trajectory, right? So if you're actually moving in the wrong direction at speed, that would be highlighted. You might still be towards the top of the table, but Jordan, you're right, that would imply if you stay on that trajectory, things are going to get pretty bleak. Obviously, think tanks like the IEA are in the idea and policy business rather than the kind of politics business. But am I right, Jordan, that in party politics in your neck of the woods, that we've seen a pretty spectacular rise of the ACT party, a pretty free market party that was associated with those sort of Thatcher Reagan-esque reforms. Used to be led by Jamie White, who's now back as a senior academic fellow at the IEA. And as I keep pointing out to Jamie White, as soon as he left the leadership of ACT, it started to zoom upwards. So isn't that some sign, Jordan, that there is at least a cohort of voters in New Zealand who are worried about the state being too big, spending being too high, taxpayers not being properly accounted for in public policy considerations?
Yeah, I mean, ACT did very well at the last election because our main opposition party, our Tories, the New Zealand National Party, was just abysmal. They went through successive leadership changes. They literally had a leader that had a nervous breakdown only a few months before the election, having toppled a leader that was probably on the path to actually beating Jacinda Ardern, but then COVID, just as it has with many opposition parties, just wiped them out. ACT peaked at, so we have I mentioned earlier, our weird electoral system that we imported bizarrely from the Germans, the mixed member proportion system, which is a European style party vote regime. ACT peaked at 18.5% in polling last year. The Nats have now gone to a sort of pretty more credible. It's the former chief executive of Air New Zealand leader, and ACT have come right back down to about 11%, 10%, depending on the polls or which poll you choose. Ours, of course, being the most credible. But I think when Jamie was there, it was more like sort of 1%. Now that's not a criticism of Jamie. He inherited a pretty sick animal, but managed to keep it on life support. And his leader, which in fairness, I'm pretty sure Jamie recruited, his successor has gone on and really rebuilt that party.
Okay. Well, Jordan, don't give him any more credit. Jamie's going to claim all the credit anyway. You know? Matt, let me come back to you.
I forget all the connections that you guys have to New Zealand.
Yeah, that's right. Well, that's right. Very strong.
We need to get
Sam Collins, a Kiwi on our payroll as well.
Exactly, and it was good to hear. Hear his voice when he called to ask. We'll certainly have to get you guys down here once we're opening. I think that we will open earlier than what the government is saying, which is middle of this year. New Zealand citizens, for the first time in 2 years, will actually be able to return to New Zealand at the end of this month, which means that, of course, New Zealanders will be able to go overseas. But we've had this before when we've opened up with Australia, but then the government shuts the borders again, and literally there is just heartbreaking stories of Kiwis stuck in Australia. They've been out of the country too long, so they stopped getting their pension or whatever, and you've got no way to get back in. This the charade was showing up pretty badly for the government and it was because it was sort of someone of the intelligentsia class, but a New Zealand journalist with some notoriety, worked for Al Jazeera and various broadcasts, news channels around the world, was pregnant, wanted to come back to New Zealand to have her baby, and the government was stuffing around and said no. And the Taliban, or she arranged with the Taliban to go to Afghanistan and get refuge there to have her baby. Jeez. And you can imagine that the liberal elite here just went ape over it, and rightfully so. But that is the single story that sort of hit The Guardian, hit the BBC, etc.
Well, it shows you as well. I mean, sometimes, you know, I'm prone to pointing out how farcical and stupid some of the regulations have been, but you're right to point out, Jordan, that they can also be horrific in consequence, not just laughable. Pretty grim. Matt, let me come back to you. What's the picture in Australia where there's a Liberal national government? I think there's an upcoming election. Is the path there, the trajectory in the wrong direction, or flatlining? What's your take on it from a kind of market orientated, you know, wanting to get taxes under, you know, down and public spending under control? Reasons to be hopeful or reasons to be pessimistic, or too early to say, Matt?
Always too early to say in the great
Always
scheme of
too early
history,
to
Mark.
say, yeah.
And I'll leave with this story as an aside. But I think it probably flatlining would be the answer. Australia went through, I mean, similar to the UK and New Zealand, a great reform era, but that really ended, certainly by the late Howard era in 2007. And we've had although just like the UK, we've had a centre-right government for almost a year now, so almost 10 years now. And it doesn't seem like you can really point to any major reforms or major achievements from a free market perspective. Australia's not a majorly more prosperous place. They've done relatively well in terms of cutting some taxes. That's nice. You can do that when the economy is growing. They almost got back into surplus, and then COVID destroyed that. I think the election coming up, though, and Jordan just put in the chat, I think accurately, ScoMo is screwed. Sorry, mate.
Scott Morrison is screwed. Sorry, mate.
Scott Morrison is screwed. I mean, I think the standard view to have, and although this was the standard view to have also last election, was that Labor, it's effectively their turn. They're up in the polls.
It was last time, right? It was last time. I thought
it was last time. Though ScoMo pulled a hat out of the bag, and the other way around, rabbit out of the hat. And managed a victory, but it was a very narrow victory. I mean, there's only a couple of seats, and you look at the electoral maths, the seats we lost in Western Australia. It's not clear that he's doing well enough in New South Wales and Queensland to pick up enough seats. You've got Victoria, where it doesn't really perform very well. Tasmania is pretty small. It just doesn't seem the electoral maths makes it very difficult for ScoMo to win the next election, just where the polls are at today. Not impossible. So you're going to have a Labor government, not a kind of communistic government, probably kind of closer to a Keir Starmer-esque government, which will chisel away at our freedoms slowly and increase state spending and whatnot. So I wouldn't exactly put things on a particularly positive line for Australia's politics.
And Matt, let me ask you, do you take Jordan's point that, I mean, I'm not saying that they set the entire framework for all international debate, but these freedom indexes that tend to put the Aussies and the Kiwis towards the top of it, does that engender a sort of complacency? Countries with your best days behind you, and still living off the glorious reforms of the 1980s and the 1990s. Is there a real sense actually of drift, and perhaps those of us who want freer, more market-orientated economies, well, we might want to look back to the Australia and New Zealand of the 1980s and the 1990s, but we don't really want to look over there today for inspiration. Or am I being too harsh on my friends from the other side of the globe?
No, I think that's more or less accurate. Australia, I think, still probably does very well in a lot of those traditional indexes, and rightfully so. Australia is, in global terms, relatively speaking, these are all relative indexes, of course, a relatively free country that's relatively easy to do business in, relatively open to trade. There's a lot of good things going on in historically in Australia that have set us on that path. But I think that you're probably right, has led to complacency. Our previous prosperity is not necessarily something that's going to survive forever, and it needs to be not chopped away at as it's currently being. So I think Australia has slowly been moving down in some of those indexes over the recent years, just as things haven't necessarily been going in the right direction politically when it comes to economic policy.
And Jordan, let me give the last word to you. Back in the 1970s, the then director of the IEA, when asked about how bleak everything was in Britain, and my God, things were pretty bleak in the 1970s, sort of pointed out to him, the trade unions are controlling everything, the commanding heights of the economy are in nationalised hands, the IMF is bailing us out, everything's going wrong. And he was asked sort of what the point of the Institute of Economic Affairs was, and he said, cheer up, things can only get worse. And what he meant from that wasn't just be phlegmatic about how things are, but that you needed almost things to get worse, unfortunately, in order to create an inflection point where people realised radical reform was necessary. Do you think, it sounds like, Jordan, you were sort of saying you're playing defence quite a lot in New Zealand at the moment. Is that what you're expecting? That there'll be sort of, the economy will tank over a period of time and then there'll be an inflection point? Or can you win these battles in, you were saying, a new battle every day? Can you win them? Can you actually shoot the alligators, or do you need to drain the swamp?
Yeah, I'm gonna have a bob each way on this one. I think yes on the economics, because New Zealand, it's a relationship similar to Canada and the US, in that the Australians don't give a flying hoot about us, but we constantly compare ourselves with Australia, and as the gap between the countries widens, then that presumably wakes New Zealanders up, especially if the Australians ever turn off the ability for Kiwis to be able to move and live over in Australia or work over there as a right. The pessimistic side is actually what is happening in one of the really strong agendas that this government is running, and that is what is called co-governance, because of our unique constitutional structure and the agreement that was done between the British Crown and our Indigenous people, and frankly the reinterpretation of that with a sort of critical race theory basis means our constitutional ground is seriously shifting against democracy, against the equal rights, and frankly against property rights. That really scares me, because once you hard bake in that entitlement based on skin color or on ethnic background, unlike the pendulums of other areas of public policy, it's really difficult to figure out. I mean, Fiji, it took 5 coups to get rid of a race-based constitution. There's lots of other countries around the world its prosperity has disappeared because of going in that direction. That's what scares me the most, because I don't know how you get the genie back in the bottle. So optimistic on some stuff. I think that it is cyclical, and it's essential that, who was it, Anthony Fisher, that said, when there is a crisis, politicians and intelligentsia will reach round for what ideas are lying around, and it's our
it's our job to keep those good ideas lying around.
Exactly. Yep. I appreciate you're a think tank. We're more of a sort of battle tank or Taxpayers Alliance style business model, but we're all pushing in the same direction. And I think the time will come for that. That said, it really scares me, because New Zealand is facing a more of a unique challenge around giving up some of those fundamentals that previous generations took for granted.
So I think we need a bit more think and a bit more tank, gentlemen. Right? That's the way to turn this around. We're clean out of time. We've overrun. But Jordan and Matt, thanks for joining us. Matt, I'll see you again very soon, assuming I can safely get back to the UK. Jordan, look forward to catching up with you as soon as the law allows. Thanks so much for joining me on this special Asia Pacific version of Live with Littlewood to put the world to rights. We've pretty much sorted out what needs to be done in the economy across the world, how to tackle China, what we got wrong on the COVID pandemic, and how to get back to those halcyon days of reform which so many of our countries witnessed in the 1980s. So Matt, Jordan, thanks very much indeed. My thanks to Raina and Donna, who joined us earlier in the show. Thanks to all of you for watching. Thanks to everybody at home. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time, and I'll be back in sunny London, back in our Westminster studio. If you enjoyed the show, please hit the thumbs up button. Remember to subscribe if you aren't already by hitting that little subscribe barrier, and hit the notification bell just next to it so that you get all the notifications of the plethora of videos that are upcoming on the IEA London YouTube channel. If you have a few pennies spare in these straitened times, it would be great if you could support our online content. IEA London has a Patreon scheme. Details are in the show notes below. My sincere thanks to all of our online patrons, but particularly to our top tier patrons, Donald Blaney, Costa Manis, James Burns, Mark Edwards, Philip Ozuth, Richard Leader, Robert Appleby, and Timothy Worrell. We greatly appreciate your support. Thanks again all for watching. Stay safe, stay free. Over and out. Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.